Yes. All right. Now here we go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Lifelong Learning Lecture. We are very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. John.
Yes.
If you haven't already muted yourself, I'm going to ask that you please do so. And please remain muted throughout this presentation to avoid any unintended disruptions, please. All right, a few things to note. Well, first of all, as I said, please mute yourselves and remain muted. I will be dropping into the chat a link to our evaluation forms. We welcome any feedback you have about tonight's lecture and any topics that you'd like to suggest for future lectures. There'll be a Q&A at the end of this lecture, and you are welcome to drop your questions into the chat, and I will read them to Dr. Huibregtse, and he will answer them for you. And with that, John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for
Do you hear or do you not care?
Thanks for attending tonight. I appreciate it. The topic tonight is conspiracy theories, and we're going to be talking not so much about specific conspiracy theories, although I'll mention a couple of those, but mostly about the political conditions in our country right now that have contributed to the growth of political theories over the last couple of decades, and also some of the factors that lead individuals to believe in conspiracy theories and adopt some of the thinking that goes with conspiracy theories. So as you know, they've become part of our national landscape pretty rapidly over the last decade or so. And it's fair to say that conditions have evolved during that time that have made the United States ripe, I would argue, for the current wave of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are not new, however. They've been around for a very long time. The promotional little thing sent out by the library had one of those early conspiracy theories on it. A couple of others from history. Late in the 18th and early 19th century, there was a belief that Freemasons and Illuminati were plotting to undermine Christianity and democratic institutions in the United States. In the 1820s, there was a slave rebellion that was put down before it really got off the ground, led by a free black man from South Carolina named Denmark Vesey. And some historians have argued that the plot was blown out of proportion by whites in South Carolina so that they could justify stricter slave laws. And then the last one that I'll mention is that in April of 1865, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, some people believe that he was part of a larger plot that united Catholics along with the collapsed Confederacy in a plot to overthrow the government. So that gives you a sense of just a couple of the conspiracy theories that have been out there historically. So as we begin, let's first of all get a definition of a conspiracy theory, and my slides are not changing here, Tara. I'm not sure what's going on. Sorry, folks.
Ooh, I'm not so sure I can help with that, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I'm trying to escape so that I can see the side view of my slides.
Okay.
Sorry, folks. Okay, well, let's oh, now
it's moving now.
There we go. Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me on that one, folks. So I'll just give you a minute to read this working definition of what a conspiracy theory is. I'll just give you a second to read that. Okay, so we get a sense of, I know that we might all have our own sort of definitions in our mind about what a conspiracy theory is. And if you were to go to another talk similar to this given by an academic coming from a different background, it might be something a little bit different, but I think this is a pretty good working definition that most folks would agree on. And we have, of course, conspiracy theories from history, but then also there are plenty of conspiracy theories still out there today. And again, the slide's not going. Okay, so conspiracy theories out there today, we have QAnon, of course, the deep state. There is a conspiracy theory surrounding COVID. Of course, Bill Gates, part of that, with the injections, the vaccines getting inserting chips in us. There's conspiracy theories about chemtrails, the trails that planes leave. The theory is that as those particles fall to Earth, they cause health problems and all kinds of other things. There's a current conspiracy theory that 5G networks that are going up for internet are actually allowing the government to track us and causing actually COVID because they're weakening our immune systems. There's also belief that people didn't land on the moon, and we'll come to that in just a minute as well. So I'm just going to leave the screen as is. I can't get the slides to move dependably, so I'm just going to ignore the PowerPoint that I have prepared. I only had about 7 or 8 slides anyway, so we'll just have to muddle through without those. So conspiracy theories have become a staple on television, which contributes to their pervasiveness in American culture. Television shows like Fringe, Stranger Things, and The X-Files, all centered on aliens, paranormal activities, and government cover-ups of those things. Other television shows like Homeland, 24, Designated Survivor, and countless others that I'm sure you can all think of also rely on conspiracy theories in one form or another. The book and movie, The Da Vinci Code from 2006 is another example, or 2 more examples, I should say. And finally, Oliver Stone's 1991 film, JFK, is sort of the granddaddy of conspiracy theory movies, at least in the last 30 or 40 years. As I said, they continue to grow. As recently as last week, Kim Kardashian said on the show The Kardashians that she believes the moon landing in 1969 was false. And she said she based her statement on clips she's seen of the astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man on the moon, who has said things that he himself said were taken out of context or edited to make it appear that the landing was fake. He said this, but Kardashian and others don't listen. And that's one of the I think earmarks of a conspiracy is that even when there's evidence out there, people who believe in the conspiracy theory don't listen to that evidence, don't listen to that hard evidence. So some may also remember about 8 years ago, the former Celtic player Kyrie Irving said that the earth was flat. And he later said that he didn't believe that and kind of pled ignorance, saying, I was really into conspiracy theories, but I'm not anymore. And I'm sure that you can think of other conspiracy theories in pop culture from movies and books and television shows that you've read, watched, and listened to. So when conspiracy theories are this pervasive, is it any wonder that they've become such significant factors in the nation's political environment? And that's the question that we're going to try to begin to answer tonight. Research has found that low satisfaction with democracy, low trust in institutions, and strong populist sentiments are associated with increased likelihood of believing in political conspiracies. This suggests that a decline in civic engagement and trust in institutions can contribute to the spread of conspiracy theories. And we'll come back to that point as we move forward tonight. So conspiracy theories, as I've said, are not new. But with the loss of faith in government and other institutions that has occurred over the last several decades, the growth of wedge issues in politics and increasing social isolationism, they have gained greater traction because people are scared, confused, and often feel out of control. And conspiracy theories help to ease those fears. Their spread, however, is detrimental to democracy. They rely on speculation, lack of credible evidence, and are typically driven by distrust of official explanations. Conspiracy theories cover a wide range of topics and most often involve elements of intrigue, cover-ups, and hidden agendas. And also, I think there's a fine line between conspiracy theories and misinformation. I would say that they are very close first cousins, so we need to at least be aware of that as we talk about conspiracy theories. One of the longest lived and widely repeated conspiracy theories is called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is one of the most infamous pieces of misinformation conspiracy theory that has perpetuated one of the most persistent and racist themes in throughout history, which is anti-Semitism. The protocols, in fact, were fabricated by the Russian secret police in 1903 and purports to detail a Jewish plot for global domination. It was plagiarized from several earlier sources, including a book entitled Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu by a French writer named Maurice Joly, which was published in 1864. This was a satirical work that was originally written as a critique of Napoleon III's regime. Napoleon, by the way, for those of you who might be reaching for your phone to see when Napoleon III ruled, I'll save you the time. He ruled from 1848 to 1870. The protocols falsely claim that Jewish leaders were planning to control the world through manipulation of financial systems, political institutions, and the media. They were published, as I said, in 1903. Just for a sentence or two of historical context, this was a time in Russia where the Jewish population was being attacked by the government of Russia. The pogroms, they're called, that had been going on for a number of years, and a lot of Jewish people left Europe, left Russia, came to Western Europe and to the United States as a result of those pogroms in the last part of the 19th and early 20th century. The protocols were exposed as fraudulent by the Times of London in 1821, and other publications followed suit and quickly debunked them, but that didn't stop them from being spread. They were widely disseminated, and they continue to be presented by anti-Semitic groups as a genuine document. Henry Ford published a series in his newspaper. The newspaper was called the Dearborn Independent. The series was called The International Jew, starting in 1920. And these were based largely on the protocols. It was published then after the newspapers published it. It was published in a 4-volume set a little bit after that. In 1927, Ford issued a half-hearted apology because he was being sued by a lawyer named Aaron Shapiro. So the apology was part of the settlement, but by that time they had been so widely disseminated and become really introduced into American culture. In the 1920s, the Second Ku Klux Klan was big in the United States, and they helped to perpetuate some of these myths and lies based on the protocols as well. And so I think some of you, or I'm sure some of you have already picked up on that there is a certain parallel between the claims and the protocols of the Elders of Zion versus some of the conspiracy theories today about the deep state controlling the government and media. And they echo closely the false claims of the protocols and the even earlier claims about the Illuminati and Catholics in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th century. So people who believe conspiracy theories often have a variety of reasons for doing so, such as cognitive biases, social influences, emotional needs, and a desire for certainty can all play a role in people's acceptance or belief of conspiracy theories. And should also note that some people believe, I mean, people who believe conspiracy theories, some believe all conspiracy theories. They sort of just, that's the way they're hardwired, so to speak, and we'll get to that in a moment. But there are others who are much more selective, and they might believe that, you know, Lee Harvey Oswald acted in concert with a group of people to assassinate Kennedy in some sort of grand conspiracy, but they also then completely dismiss QAnon and um, other conspiracy theories as well. So it's not necessarily an all or nothing. A lot of people might believe some conspiracy theories and totally disagree with other conspiracy theories. So it's not a black and white kind of acceptance of conspiracy theories necessarily. So it's important to understand that the belief in conspiracy theories is a complex phenomenon, excuse me, and it can't be attributed to a single cause or a single political ideology. In other words, in today's very divided America, there are people on both sides of the spectrum that believe in some conspiracy, conspiracies to one degree or another. Okay. Um, Conspiracy theories are often more prevalent from groups that lack power or feel that they don't have power. And there is research that suggests that to some extent, believing in conspiracy theories is hardwired into people's brains. One of the elements that is essential to the spread of conspiracy theories is the loss of faith in previously stable institutions. Tonight, I'll discuss how that's playing out in America right now, looking at three institutions or three elements of American society. One is the government, the second is the press, and finally, we'll look at the educational system. So let's look at loss of faith in the government over, say, the last half century or so. That begins with Watergate. The Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s is another example of that. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal in the 1990s led to Bill Clinton's impeachment. The Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And I think even more than the Great Recession, associated with that was the lack of accountability for those who were held responsible. And think of all of the too big to fail banks, financial institutions, and the executives who were, excuse me, who were responsible for the crash, but they were not held accountable. And they flew into Washington in their private jets for hearings and so forth. And that did a lot to really hurt the credibility of the government. And lastly, last thing I'll mention is President George W. Bush lying about weapons of mass destruction and Iraq's involvement in 9/11, which both proved to be false. While those are major federal mistakes, this loss of faith in authority and institutions is widespread throughout the United States. I moved to Massachusetts nearly 30 years ago, and at that time, I remember being kind of surprised by the attitude that when the state government was involved, it was kind of expected and accepted that there was going to be a level of inefficiency and there was going to be a low level of corruption, which on one level was kind of frightening because I worked for the state at a state university. But also keep in mind, this was at the height of the big dig, so that might have contributed some to that negative feeling towards government at that point. So Trump's populist message exploits this idea that government cannot be trusted, and it is effective because people have lost trust in the government. And Trump's populism is largely based, at least some of it is based on, his idea from his first administration of cleaning out the swamp, his distrust of government, and secondly, breaking the status quo and doing things that are 10 or 15 years ago would have been thought unthinkable for a president. And that's all part of his populism and part of it's a symptom of people having lost trust in the government and basically letting him get away with some of this stuff. So there's a lot of data also. It's not just sort of this anecdotal things looking at politicians. According to the Pew Research Trust, and they asked the question in 1958, um, they asked Americans if they believed they could trust the government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. So almost always or most of the time. And I'll give you a second to think about that. If you're sitting with someone, tell them a number, a percentage, and see if anybody gets close. So in your head, play the Jeopardy theme here for about 3 or 4 seconds. What percentage of Americans in 1958 said they could trust the government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time? And the answer is 73% of Americans in 1958 said they could trust the government to do the right thing all of the time or most of the time. Okay, let that sink in for just a second or two. In 2023, they asked the same question. And again, think about it for a second. I'll give you a second to think about it or give a number to the person sitting next to you. What percentage of people trusted the government to do the right thing always or most of the time? And if anybody said 22%, you would have won Final Jeopardy on that question. But let's think about that for a second. Just give it some thought. In 1958, almost 3/4 of the population said they trusted the government to do the right thing. 50 odd years, 60 odd years later, that number had dropped to just under 1/4 of the people trust the government to do the right thing all of the time or most of the time. I find that figure stunning. So another institution that people have lost faith in over the last half century or so is news sources and where we get our news. Okay. Fake news entered our political discourse a lot over the last decade. Actually, it's been around a lot longer than that. The Ku Klux Klan back in the 20s talked about fake news. So it's not a term that was coined recently, but it hasn't been used very much in the past until the last decade or so. It's undermining an important institution for the perpetuation of democracy, and that is free, unfettered journalism. The founding fathers created the First Amendment because they believed the free press would be able to hold officials, government officials, accountable. They had faith that the voters would recognize corruption and abuses of power and vote those folks out. And it was the press's job to make people aware of those problems. In our own time, at least for many of us, think back to Watergate. That was exposed largely because of the reporting of famously Woodward and Bernstein, but there were a lot of other reporters who were there reporting on that, especially in the early stages. Another example is the Iran-Contra affair came to light. I believe it was the reporting by CBS News that brought that to light. So those are a couple of examples of how the press is supposed to work and holding government officials accountable. That is not happening as much anymore. 2 months ago in September, the president told reporters in the Oval Office that critical media coverage of him was, quote, illegal, stating that, further quoting, when 97% of the stories are bad about a person, it's no longer free speech. Just last month, during a roundtable discussion of Antifa and flag burning, Trump said, "We took away the freedom of speech," unquote. And that was in reference to an executive order he signed calling for the prosecution of people who burn flags. According to reporting in Axios, since 2021, the president has filed 22 lawsuits against news organizations, including, this isn't the full 21, but gives you a good example or a good smattering of who he has sued. The Associated Press, the New York Times, the Des Moines Register, CBS, NPR, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting are among the 22 lawsuits that he has filed against the media in the last 4 years. Recently, Melania Trump, some of you probably saw this in the news as well, threatened to sue a journalist named Michael Wolff for more than $1 billion because he published a story linking her to the Epstein files. These actions, along with the constant cries of fake news, have convinced many Americans to not trust news sources, unless, of course, the news sources are saying something that the person listening or reading happens to agree with. This has contributed to the echo chamber effect that plagues both sides of the political spectrum and also is detrimental to democracy. The last thing I'll mention in terms of losing faith in institutions is school curriculum and education. Attacks on schools and their curriculum have become a staple in American politics. In February of 2025 at the National Prayer Breakfast, the president said, quote, "We will not fund schools that teach students to hate their country." And that phrase about hate their country is something that I'm sure many of you, like me, have seen in the news that has been a pretty steady drumbeat recently. Trump called for ending all teaching of, quote, "divisive equity ideology," unquote, and for traditional historical narratives that focus on great white men to be reinstated into the school curriculum. Through an executive order, Trump is trying to eliminate the Department of Education. At the state level, more than 250 bills targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, DEI, have been filed, and some of those have passed, some of those have failed. They're trying to defund student clubs, defund humanities departments, and attack affirmative action policies. So the government, the press, and schools, three very significant bulwarks of American life, being continually attacked, belittled, and vilified. These conditions help to create the ecosystem where people are more prone to look for simple solutions or explanations to issues that are often very complex. People who embrace conspiracy theories tend to be in search of such easy explanations to problems that, as I said, and you all know, are very complex. So conspiracy theories, of course, are not new. The protocols and the others that I mentioned have been there historically. But I think this is the first time in American history where they've really come to the forefront and are a driving force in our politics and in the political process that's going on. So shifting gears a little bit here to help us understand how we've gotten to this point, let's examine why people believe conspiracy theories. It's a straightforward question, but it's a really complex answer. And I'm a historian by training. This delves a little bit probably more into psychology. And so bear with me. I'm doing the best I can as a historian looking into issues that are more psychological. The simple answer, though, is that people believe in conspiracy theories for a variety of psychological, social, and emotional reasons. According to research published in Psychology Today, however, the most significant factor is a desire for understanding and certainty. Okay, keep that in mind, a desire for understanding and certainty. According to the psychologist, author named Rob Brotherton, in 2015, he published a book called Suspicious Minds: Why We Believe in Conspiracy Theories. And he argues that it may be that believing in conspiracy theories is hardwired, that it's just part of our mental makeup that exists in our subconscious and so is largely out of our control. That may be true, may be partially true. I'm sure more research will be done on that. But one thing that conspiracy theories do is they can provide a sense of understanding, of certainty, and for some people, control in a world that is very uncertain and pretty scary sometimes. So at this point, it's fair if you're sitting there listening to me thinking, well, I'm human and I don't believe in conspiracy theories and find most of them to be kind of silly. I'm with you. I kind of agree with that. But keep in mind that everyone reacts differently to situations and stimuli. Think about some of you, your siblings might be very different than you. They might be on the other side of the political spectrum, and you grew up together, eating at the same table, sharing a bedroom, sharing a bathroom, everything that, siblings do. And yet they are on one end of the political spectrum and you're on the other end of the political spectrum. So, everybody reacts differently to different situations or differently, even though they might be experiencing something exactly the same through the same stimuli, the same experience, what have you. So one of the factors that has contributed to the rise of conspiracy theories recently is the tumultuous world that we live in with very complex and troubling issues. And there are no easy solutions for many of these problems. Just take one example, global warming. There is no easy solution to global warming. And it would take sacrifice and hard work by everybody to really turn around some of the um, the signs of global warming and the symptoms of global warming. It would take a lot of effort and it's hard. And so we just think about that as one example of a major problem for which there are no easy solutions. And there are many other problems that we could think of as well. So when coupled with this loss of faith in previously trusted institutions, along with the troubled world that we live in, it's created something like a perfect storm for conspiracy theories to take off and to become part of our dialogue, part of our political discourse. Many of us on this Zoom session this evening were baby boomers. We grew up with the Cold War. The threat of nuclear destruction hung over our heads. Some of you are probably old enough to remember doing duck and cover drills in school. I'm on the tail end of sort of the baby boom generation, so I'm a little young, but certainly was in school during the, the Cold War, which was pretty scary stuff. But in the 50s and 60s, one of the big differences, I think, between then and now is that in the 50s and 60s, say the height of the Cold War, there was an optimism in America that had a leavening effect on some of the scarier conditions that were out there. Um, so the Cold War was a major potential disruption. Potential disruption really downplays the severity of it, but it was certainly hanging over everyone's head. But this optimism was there that leavened things out, I think, and that optimism seems to be lacking today, which is another contributing factor. So the Cold War is over, obviously, but the fear and uncertainty that the Cold War brought have just reappeared in other ways and other things that are creating stress for students and for everybody, not just students. For one, since we started out talking about kids in school and Cold War and duck and cover drills, school shootings, as we all know, are on the rise. Depending upon how they are defined, there have been somewhere between 8 and 146 school shootings this year that have left about 3 dozen people dead. And when I was teaching, parenthetically, I just kind of go off script for a moment. When I was teaching in one of my classes, we got into a discussion about school shootings, and this was with mostly freshmen, right out of high school, obviously. And what I thought was going to be about a 15-minute discussion at the end of one class bloomed into um, that 15 minutes and then the whole next day talking about school shootings and the fear that these students had about school shootings, and as kids, how scary it was going into lockdown drills and so forth. Unfortunately, none of them had experienced the school shooting, but um, it's palpable that fear in students is really palpable today. So school shootings would be one thing. The economic turmoil that we are going through, going back to the Great Recession of 15 years ago, the inflation that we're going through now, but going even further back, think of inflation and the economic turmoil of the 1970s and the 1980s as well. So that economic turmoil, the shrinking of the middle class, it's harder and harder for kids getting out of school to obtain the same things that their parents did. The cost of housing here in New England, of course, is through the roof, and it's really hard for young people to save up enough to actually own their own home. Climate change, mentioned that a moment ago. The global pandemic that we've been through in the last 5 or 6 years. While there was an optimism in the 1950s and 60s about America, I would argue that there's a pessimism there today. And of course, Make America Great Again plays on that fear. Just the phrase itself, great again, implies that America is not great. So that the decline of America, with a question mark in my notes, I'm not sure I buy into that theme. And then finally, the changing racial makeup of America is another thing that is causing a lot of concern. The great replacement theory, as conspiracy theorists call it, is this idea that the government is encouraging white Americans not to have children so that demographers estimate that in about 20 years, whites will be a minority, the largest minority, but still a minority as more people of color um, come to America and have higher birth rates. So all of these things, and I'm sure if you and I were sitting around together over a cup of coffee, shooting the breeze, we could come up with a lot of other things as well that are causing fear and anxiety in America. But those are just a few of the things that are doing so. So as history shows us, though, and here we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the internet here and its contribution. History shows us that the internet is not a prerequisite for conspiracy theories. They existed long before the internet did. If through some sort of magic the internet would disappear tomorrow, conspiracy theories would still exist. And if the internet were to disappear tomorrow, that would create a great conspiracy for somebody to think about, wouldn't it? Um, but they didn't create conspiracy theories. They existed long before the internet. But the internet is really important for the spread of conspiracy theories. And we wouldn't be in this moment that we are in history right now without the internet. So, how does the internet help with the spread of conspiracy theories? Well, a couple of reasons, a couple of things. First of all, the algorithms that influence the internet and the platforms like Facebook, YouTube, um, uh, I'm blanking, Instagram, thank you, Instagram and so forth. All of the internet platforms use algorithms that recommend content based on the preferences that all of us have as users. I'm sure we've all experienced where you click on one thing and for the next 2 weeks you're getting all kinds of ads for whatever it is that you clicked on. So these algorithms can create echo chambers where users are exposed to similar content that oftentimes reinforces the beliefs they already have. And it makes it much easier for conspiracy theories to spread as well. So these platforms have demonstrated that changing algorithms can actually cut down the spread of misinformation and all kinds of conspiracy theories. But they generally are not inclined to use those algorithms. The government could step in and try to regulate these platforms and ensure that these algorithms were not used, but that's highly unlikely in today's political environment. So that's one point. Another point that makes it easy to spread conspiracy theories on the internet is the ease of access that people have on the internet. They can share conspiracy theories, even if they lack credibility. There's no filter there to stop things from being spread, so they spread very easily. Related to that is the anonymity of being online. Individuals can share and promote anything they want without fear of repercussions, with a few exceptions. Um, they can go viral. Of course, conspiracy theories often contain sensational or shocking claims that can go viral. Um, and then these last 2 points I want to mention, and they kind of set up the last few minutes of my talk then. And one of those is that the internet allows for community building. The internet enables like-minded individuals to connect and form communities around shared beliefs. And these communities can amplify conspiracy theories and create a sense of belonging for their members, which is really important. And then the last point about the internet is the rise of the internet has led to a decline in newspaper viewership and watching unbiased TV news. And by unbiased, I'm thinking of shows that try to be unbiased, news shows, news programming. I certainly would not include Fox or MSNBC or even CNN in that category. I'm thinking mostly of the three older major networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Um, but newspapers also, in the last 70 years, between 1950 and 2020, the number of daily newspapers has declined from about 1,700 in 1950, 1,700 daily newspapers in 1950, to about 1,260 daily newspapers in America in 2020. So a decline of almost 500 newspapers, about 440 newspapers, daily newspapers have disappeared in the last 70 years. Um, Back in 1950, most of those newspapers that were being published were owned locally, owned by someone in the city where they were being published. And by today, that has changed dramatically as many of those daily newspapers have been bought up by big corporations. For example, the two biggest newspaper corporations in America are Gannett Newspapers, Gannett, which owns 215 newspapers across the country, and their flagship paper is the USA Today. So they own 215. The next biggest news corporation is the Tribune News Group, which started with the Chicago Tribune. It owns 77 newspapers across the country, not near the 215, but still easily the second biggest of these corporations. So that's a total of 392 newspapers owned by two corporations in the United States, or approximately a quarter of the daily newspapers in the country are owned by those two corporations. So with that, even though the American population has increased dramatically over the last 70 years, circulation of dailies is down about 40% in the last decade. Let's turn to TV news for a moment. Nightly news viewership has also taken a pretty severe hit over the last few decades. In the 1960s, evening news programs on ABC, CBS, and NBC regularly attracted millions of viewers. CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite in the early 60s averaged around 7 million viewers per night. That was head and shoulders the most watched news program in the early 1960s. By 2023, viewership had declined considerably. By 2023, ABC, CBS, NBC evening news programs combined averaged around 18 million viewers. Now, I know that's a little bit of apples and oranges. I couldn't find an exact number for 1963 or an approximate number for all viewership in 1963, and it was easier to find one for 2023. So I understand that that's a little bit of apples and oranges, but the decline is even more dramatic, though, and this holds true for newspaper circulation as well. When you consider that the US population in the 1950s was about 180 million, and today it's about 340 million. So not quite doubled over that 70-year period. So taken in that context, those declines are even more stark. Another change in the television and radio news world is something called the Fairness Doctrine. It was eliminated in the late 1980s during the Reagan presidency. The Fairness Doctrine was created in the late 1940s when television was in its infancy, and Congress was concerned that television was going to influence people and influence them in a way that congressmen thought would be detrimental to American democracy and so forth. So they created the Fairness Doctrine, and the Fairness Doctrine said that television and radio stations had to offer equal time to both sides or all three sides or however many sides there were of important issues for people. So it ensured that, if I came on and talked for 10 minutes about how I thought a new school was a great idea in our particular town, that someone else got 10 minutes to say why the old school was good enough and we didn't need to spend this money on a new school. So the Fairness Doctrine existed, but as I said, it was eliminated during the Reagan presidency. And it's not a coincidence that with the end of the Fairness Doctrine in the late 80s, that it's shortly after that we have a rise of talk radio, which has been such an important component of our political DNA for the last 40 or 50 years. So this decline in these what I would call traditional news sources is also pretty significant. Newspapers weren't necessarily governed by the Fairness Doctrine, but many of them did make an effort to be fair. And if they tended to be more, liberal, left center in their editorial policy, they often had conservative columnists on the other side of the editorial pages so that you were getting both sides of the story. The paper I grew up reading in my hometown was kind of left center, leaning Democratic, but they had Calvin Trillian and other William F. Buckley were published as well, so that there was that conservative view was there along with the paper's own editorial policies. So this decline in traditional news sources is also detrimental, I would argue. According to a 2024 Pew Research Center report, about 54% of American adults say they got at least some of their news from social media sources, and those sources may or may not be credible. Here's an example. If any of you on Zoom tonight were my former students, you might have heard me say this before. I think between news sources and the rise of the internet, it's an example of Newton's third law. And Newton's third law is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And as the internet has become more of a source for news, and I use that term loosely when referring to the internet, we've seen a decline in traditional newspapers and the watching of TV news. And, television, excuse me, television, ABC, NBC, CBS, the old school television newspapers, they were governed by a code of ethics by the Society of Professional Journalists that required them to, when they made mistakes, to come out and publish those mistakes or say we made these mistakes. And that, of course, does not exist on the internet. And in some degrees, or in some ways, that might be sort of antiquated with the news cycle moving on so fast these days. You publish something 24 hours later admitting a mistake, but the news cycle is perhaps way moved on since then at any rate. So all of those things have contributed to, I think, the growth of conspiracy theories, the loss of faith in institutions, particularly the news media has been a part of this rise of conspiracy theories. Another issue that has contributed to the rise of conspiracy theories are something called wedge issues in politics. For those of you who don't know, a wedge issue is something that's a highly divisive issue that generally polarizes public opinion and creates splits within groups. This polarization creates an environment where people are more likely to seek out information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs, making them more susceptible to conspiracy theories that align with their own views. For any of you political junkies out there, wedge issues really became a thing that were exploited by Richard Nixon and his team in the late 60s and early 70s. And they've just been used continually since then, and more effectively. And you see them being used very effectively today in today's political environment in the United States. Wedge issues often involve criticism of established institutions such as government, media, education, which we talked about at length already tonight. I'm not going to delve into this, but also the scientific community as well falls under that criticism as vaccines have become questioned more and more, and so forth. So this criticism of these institutions erodes trust, making people more likely to believe in alternative explanations, such as conspiracy theories or other things that we could just consider gross misinformation that continues to spread. Wedge issues are often emotionally charged. Individuals may be less likely, because they're so emotionally charged, to evaluate information and more likely to accept sensational claims or conspiratorial claims about those issues. Wedge issues, by their very nature, are intended to divide people, and they often do so by vilifying the other. Examples of wedge issues: abortion, gun control, immigration, same-sex marriage. These often evoke strong emotions. They can lead to significant division. I'm sure some of you have had very negative experiences trying to talk about those issues, or others with people that disagree with you, and our political climate has become less and less accepting of views that are different than our own, and I think that's part of the growth of conspiracy theories as well. So the last thing I'm going to mention is the declining civic engagement and social isolation that's been on the rise in America for a long time. There is evidence to suggest a correlation between declining civic and religious engagement and the growth of conspiracy theories. Studies have shown that social isolation and lack of community ties can make individuals more susceptible to conspiracy theories. A book published in the early 2000s called Bowling Alone chronicles how, in the half century prior to its publication, so approximately 1950 to 2000, Americans were becoming increasingly less involved in their communities. They joined fewer clubs, they joined fewer civic organizations, they had friends over for dinner or went out to dinner with friends less frequently. They attended church less frequently. They played in fewer social sports leagues, and they played cards less frequently as well. While this data is 25 years old, it's still instructive for us. And nothing has happened in the last 25 years since the book was published to suggest that any of these trends have significantly reversed themselves in America. Not surprisingly, there is statistical evidence that the pandemic increased social isolation and led to a significant rise in loneliness. And for those of us, all of us who lived through that, tell us something we don't know, right? The American Psychological Association did a massive study of all kinds of material that was published, and from all of this published information, they determined that there's been about a 5% increase in the prevalence of loneliness in the United States as a result of the pandemic. Another systematic review highlighted that the quality of social relationships was perceived to have gotten worse during the pandemic, and the quantity of social interactions also decreased. Again, for those of us who lived through that, it doesn't seem like you need an academic to tell you that. We all lived through that and experienced that, right? So in conclusion, the loss of community and connection is hugely significant in the rise of conspiracy theories. One reason that people buy into them is because that by doing so, They join a community of like-minded individuals who can fulfill a need for social connection and identity. And of course, the internet makes that so much easier than it was previously. As people grow, as people move away from traditional forms of civic and communal engagement to become more isolated, they are less likely to encounter people whose opinions and views differ from their own. Decline of traditional news sources like newspapers and TV news has sped up this process as well. The internet has contributed to the rise of echo chambers where people only get news that fits their worldview, which makes it in turn easier to otherize those who disagree with them. Becoming more isolated means we're more likely to fall into economic chambers, or excuse me, into echo chambers and confirmation bias. So what can be done to combat conspiracy theories? And this was my last slide if they were working. Several things to think about. One is education and critical thinking skills. For those of you out there who might have been in higher education like I was, you know that critical thinking and critical thinking skills has been a buzzword for decades in higher education. Verify information, no matter where you're getting your news from, don't just accept it. Promote open dialogue. Try to have those conversations that are hard to have. Support quality, unbiased journalism. Report misinformation to wherever it was published, if you can. I know if it's published, if you're seeing it on Facebook and it's something that's been forwarded 6 times, that's pretty hard to do. Critical self-reflection. Ask yourself why you believe stuff, what evidence is it really evidence, or is it just more your gut that's telling you something? And lastly, encourage fact checking and conversation. And I'll be honest, I hate that when people pull out their phones in conversation to look stuff up, and I'm guilty of it. I don't like doing it, but it can be important when people are saying stuff that you just don't believe, and you can demonstrate to them that that is inaccurate. So again, thank you for listening. Thank you for attending this evening. I am really sorry that my slides didn't work. I only had about 7 or 8, but they would have been helpful to have, and you could have seen all of those things I just listed as bullet points and not just me reading them. So again, thank you, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Huibregtse. I'd like to remind everyone that if you do have a question, please drop it in the chat. I'll be happy to read it to him. In the meantime, we do have a question from Deb. And she writes, decline in TV news viewership. What are the numbers between the 1960s and 2023? I'm curious if there is a particular decade there where it dropped off, and was it a steady decline, or was it a steady decline? Does it coincide with tech developments like the internet or cable news channels? And I think you answered some of this before.
I did a little bit, but it has, you said Deb asked this question?
Yeah.
Okay, so hi Deb, thank you. I think that the biggest answer is you hit on the 2 biggest things that I would say in your question, and that is the rise of the internet and the rise of cable news. Those are the 2 biggest. I am certainly guilty of looking at my phone an awful lot to get the news. I generally look at the AP, the Associated Press, and the New York Times, and other sources as well. But then also the rise of cable news has drawn a lot of people away from the traditional networks of ABC, NBC, and CBS. And some of those viewers are on, Fox News, they're on MSNBC, they're on CNN, they're on other news channels that have less concern about being unbiased, and they create that echo chamber where people are just more comfortable hearing stories that they feel comfortable with, that sort of fit their worldview, and not hear that other side. So it's been a gradual decline, but definitely the rise of the internet and cable news are the two of the big components of that decline.
Hmm. So I'm kind of curious, just to build on that question.
Yep.
Uh, what do you think AI is going to do?
Huh. Um, AI is going to make all of this more and more difficult to um, discern. And when I say all of this, I really mean news and the validity of news. It's going to make it harder and harder to discern. And um, yeah, it's just going to be tough. I mean, we've all seen probably stuff on the internet created by fake news. Excuse me, not by fake news, by AI that is pretty convincing if you don't know that it's AI generated. I watched something a couple weeks ago that said the Trump family is now into wind power, and it was this whole AI generated thing about how the Trumps were buying up wind farms across the country. And of course, it's nonsense. But if you didn't know it was nonsense, the Trump generated voice was really good. They had Don Jr. also voice sounded pretty similar, really um, consistent with how his voice sounded. And it was satirical, but that's going to be harder and harder to discern. And AI is in its infancy. What's it going to be? And now I'm asking the question, rhetorically, what's it going to be 5 or 10 years down the road when AI is even more sophisticated than it is today? It's going to be really hard to be able to pick out what's real and what's not. And that's where education and critical thinking needs to really start to play even a bigger role than it is already.
Mm, right. I've got one more question for you. When you talked earlier about the reasons for conspiracy theories, I'm curious if there was ever a conspiracy theory that began for financial reasons.
Mm. Well, um, a conspiracy theory that began for financial reasons. There, there probably was. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but people being people, there was probably conspiracy theories around the stock market crash in 1929 in the United States.
Mm.
Um, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm guessing there were conspiracy theories around the crash in 2008 and 2009 as well. Um, because yeah, I would guess that there were, but I can't point to one specifically and say, yes, there's an example of that answers that question.
Okay, I was just curious to see if that was one of the, driving motives behind creating a conspiracy theory.
So
But I wanted,
yeah, go ahead.
oh,
Sorry.
sorry. I was hoping we could revisit the question I had for you earlier about the fine line between misinformation and when misinformation becomes a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I wish I would have had a whole hour just to think about that instead of giving up the presentation. A good question, though. Um, I think, first of all, you can all see the um, definition of conspiracy theory in front of you that I had on my slide. And, I think misinformation would be to use something in a current thing. Say misinformation involving, say, vaccines. Okay,
Mhm.
someone just says vaccines don't work, and they start to spread that across the internet. Okay, that would be misinformation. I think it would, but then evolve into a conspiracy when it becomes something like, well, doctors don't want you to get vaccinated because they're going to make more money if you're getting sick, or
Mm.
the government doesn't want you to get vaccinated for whatever reason, or people are going to benefit by you getting vaccinated, that you don't want them to benefit from that, so you shouldn't get vaccinated. So misinformation is, I, I would guess misinformation is kind of a singular thing. I would define it as a singular thing, whereas uh, conspiracy theory involves more people and subplots and kind of sinister, a certain sinister component to it that misinformation doesn't necessarily contain.
Okay. We've got one more question in the chat from Diane. What responsibility do our public representatives have to us in delivering facts instead of misinformation? What is the best way for us to hold them to telling the truth?
Okay, great question, Diane. Thank you. Well, I think that our public representatives, our representatives, have, I think that them presenting us with the truth is pretty much job one. That should be in their job description. That they need to present us with the truth. And how do we hold them accountable? I think voting is the obvious answer. We get out and vote. But beyond that, I think, as good citizens of a democratic republic, we should, if, question them, we should write them, email them, phone them. If they come into the district, go to their office, try to sit down with them, talk with them. Um, and hold them accountable. And if they say something that to be false, find the newspaper story, the study, whatever evidence you have that shows that what they just said is false, and send it to them and make them aware of it. And in this is just my opinion now, if they're worth their salt and you've called them out on something that they've honestly and genuinely just made a mistake, and we all do that, we're human, right? Then they're going to come back and say, well, you know I made a mistake, I misspoke here, or something to that effect. So stay on top of what they're saying, fact check them, and call them out when they misinform, if and when they misinform us.
Great. Well, we don't have any more questions at this time, but I'd like to thank you very much for your time tonight. This was a great lecture.
Thank
Hope we
you.
have you again soon. And,
Yeah, I'm doing another one of these in March, so I look forward to it.
oh, wonderful. Well, in the meantime, thank you everyone for coming out and joining us tonight. And don't forget that we have another lecture next week. So join us again. And until then, have a good night, everyone.
Thanks again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.